Hey guys, this is Clark Hellscream. I just wanted to make a video today to highlight how I attained Legend this season and the 5 decks that I used. They're all in front of you. I got Tempo Rogue, Zoolock, Burn Mage, Murloc Paladin, and Big Priest. The ones that I used the most were definitely Big Priest and Murloc Paladin. I think that these two decks are one of the most powerful ones in the meta right now, or at least the most powerful decks that I can make at the moment. You don't see Q block on here because I don't have all the necessary cards, and there's a few other decks like Dragon, Druid that I also wanted to try out, but I just don't have all the necessary tools in order to make the lists. I only got so much out of my 50 packs from Kobolds and Catacombs pre-order, so I kind of just worked with what I was given. So let's go through the cards and the decks to see what exactly I've been using and what I have found success with. So 3 of the decks I've used have been aggro decks. A lot of them have Corridor Creepers in it because this card is just absolutely bonkers in aggro decks. I'm pretty sure that this card might receive some kind of nerf soon, but we're not going to get too ahead of ourselves here. Let's just focus on the season as of right now. So Tempo Rogue is pretty much the same, aside from the inclusions of Corridor Creeper and the Elven Minstrels. This card is particularly really good for just keeping yourself alive and sustaining board presence for the later game or mid-game. Other than that, it's just the same battle approach. Try to get Kelazeth. If you can Shadow Step him, that's fantastic. Get as big of a board as you can without uh, without putting yourself in a situation against like control decks to where your board just gets destroyed. But yeah, just this deck is pretty much the same as previous expansions. It's just, oh, this card is so good. Next up, we have Zoolock. This is what I originally used for my climb to rank 5, but this was at the beginning of the expansion when people were still testing out stuff, and Control Warlock was definitely not a thing. If Control Warlock was a thing during my climb, I would have not seen as well of numbers as I did. But this is still a pretty good deck when you take Control Warlock out of the equation. It's pretty good against the other aggro decks except for Murloc Paladin. I think Murloc Paladin just has a way of keeping the minions alive or threatening you faster, and since you're also doing damage to yourself, it's not helping. The biggest thing with this deck is making sure that you're not put in too much of the defensive role. You want to be able to trade with your minions in order to maximize your board and minimize their threats, but you can't forget your game plan is to kill them at the end. But Blood Reaver Gul'dan is a really good card to give you some kind of late game presence, especially with bringing back like your Doom Guards or your Despicable Dreadlords. I would suggest this for a budget player that really can't afford to get too many really expensive cards, but keep in mind it does have Blood Reaver Gul'dan, and this isn't exactly a card you can tech out. Like, you just would have to use another win condition card in order to tech this guy out. He's just way too powerful. I mean, you could also argue that you don't want him in the deck because you're going to mainly be discarding cards, but this card is just really good, so I would argue against you saying that you would want this card in your deck. Next up, we have Tempo Mage. Oh, man. This deck is just absolutely crazy. I would think it's probably aside from Q Block, it's the #1 tested deck at the moment, aside from maybe a Priest deck. I haven't really been checking how popular lists have been, just how viable and how well they've been doing. But this is one of the first decks to where Cabal Lackey is very, very prominent in all the lists. Like, it used to be that this card was not enough, even with the secret, to give you an advantage. But now, with Explosive Runes dealing damage to the face and a minion as well, and Counterspell getting those really good early game spells, it's very, very powerful. This deck highlights Leroy, because Leroy is a really good finisher, and it can activate as another Fireball, for example. In case you just need to be able to just hit face when you can in order to avoid taunts, because with spells you don't have to worry about that. The other card from the new expansion obviously is a Lunith. This card is just absolutely nuts. Being able to draw a 10th of your deck every single turn is absolutely ridiculous. Like, this is the whole reason why this deck comes together. You have a lot of cards that have discounted mana costs, cards that reduce mana costs, such as like Primordial Glyph, so you really don't have to worry too much about your hand becoming too full, because you'll be able to just get rid of all of your cards with very much ease. The next deck, this is what I used from rank 2 into rank 1, is Murloc Paladin. This is like the deck that everyone has been like saying is the best deck, and I would agree with them. This deck is just so good. Why is it good? Your turn ones. You usually just have a turn one, and with this deck, having a turn one just increases your win rate. But I would argue like at least 15%. Like being able to just like even playing a chum that gets destroyed the next turn, or forcing your opponent to just react to it, is already putting them by turn one in a defensive situation. So say you play this and then it buffs like a Murloc Tidecaller, uh, then you get to be able to play your Murloc Tidecaller as a 2/3, and then if you have another one drop, such as like this, then bam, you have two Murlocs that are a threat and they have to get rid of them. Like this deck just has the ability to snowball as early as turn 3, and yeah, the main reasons for them is for it being sustained in the mid game is also for Call of Arms, because this card just say for example you're against a Warlock and they use Hellfire to completely kill your Murlocs, and you have a War Leader in your hand, and you're like, oh, I wanted to use my War Leader to get a bunch of damage. Well, say you top deck Cold Arms on turn 4, you bring up 3 more Murlocs from your deck, and then they don't have a board clear next turn. Well, you get your Murloc War Leader with some pretty juicy damage. So this deck just has almost everything it needs. Like the Spellbreaker, I would highly, highly, highly recommend, because Control Warlock is really difficult when a Void Lord comes out on early turns. Like you just can't trade into it because your board will die, and you need your minions to survive with this deck. There's not that many buffs. There's only one weapon, and Unidentified Maul is actually like a really good card in this deck. It can build board, it can keep your board, or it can produce threats. The taunt is actually not as bad as I originally thought, because against other aggro decks, like yeah, they would have keen trades most of the time, but if you have like really buff Warlocks that give the taunt, then you can put yourself in a pretty good situation. I would say the taunt is still one of the worst ones out there, just because I'd rather have minions, attack, or divine shield. But you can definitely find some uses out of it, and most times you're just going to be playing it for the effect, and having the 2/2 attached to it is just really powerful. The last deck is the deck that I use mainly from my rank 5 climb, and I stuck with this deck just because I got a lot of practice with it during Knights of the Frozen Throne, and the biggest card to bring attention to is definitely the Diamond Spellstone. Like even if you're playing this card to just bring out like an Obsidian statue or just like one minion, sometimes it can be the only thing you need is just that one minion. Like that's why this deck is really good, because getting a Barnes pull wins you the game. Getting a Shadow Essence pull can really win you the game, or like just clearing the board against some decks can just win you the game. Like against Murloc Paladin, if you have a pint size horror clear, then sometimes that just flats out win you the game because they don't have any other resources, and they could have thrown away everything and they have nothing in their hand. But aside from that, you still have a bunch of other board clears, Holy Fire inclusion for Cobalt Scalevanes, because that card is still somewhat prominent, or just getting rid of mid-game minions in general. The biggest thing to consider is again with Diamond Spellstone, it gives your deck another win condition. You can stick minions with this deck and just have them deal damage. It just wins. You're dealing with like 18 damage turns every time, and sometimes your opponent will have a clear for it. But if you're just able to keep up presence, then you can really just you can dive it hard. The other matchup I want to highlight specifically is against Q Block and against Control Warlock, because I found that with this deck, I'm not sure if this is the right approach, but I'm going to do some more testing before I like make an official announcement. But so far, I've had pretty good success going into Fatigue against those decks. This deck doesn't draw that much, and if they just really use their early game to just keep drawing cards and they don't lay down an early cool ban, then you can keep your life total healthy enough in order to sustain yourself into Fatigue, because they're drawing more cards, and really the only time that you pull cards from your actual deck is when Yashiraj is on the field, and there's only 6 minions in the deck total, and that's given that you've played Barnes, and if you're playing Yashiraj on turn 10, then you're probably not too worried about the number of cards left in your deck, because the Warlock is drawing a lot. So hopefully that'll give you guys a pretty good look into what the meta is kind of like right now. It's still changing. There's still a bunch of new decks that could come out of nowhere. especially since the meta is starting to somewhat simmer down, so people are going to start teching against it. But yeah, if you guys have any questions, feel free to comment, leave me a question on Twitter. I always try to respond as quickly as possible, so hopefully I get to hear you guys soon. Tune in next time.